It wasn't the silence that broke him. It was the fact that the silence never had a chance to speak its truth. Julian Cross had once believed in the kind of love that didn't need labels, declarations, or validation. He believed in shared mornings, in the way one person brewed coffee for the other without asking. He believed in waiting up late, just to see the light of someone else's headlights turn into the driveway. For years, that belief had a name, Reed Mavern. They met during their graduate years in literature. Reed was brilliant, ambitious, magnetic in a way that made everyone want to orbit him, but he kept his own orbit closed. To the world, he was confident and composed, but in private, in the quiet corners of shared dorms and early mornings, he let Julian in, just enough to make him stay. Reed never said, "I love you," but he didn't have to, not when he reached across the bed to hold Julian at night, not when he remembered how he liked his tea, not when he traced his fingers along the spine of Julian's first published poem and said, "This feels like home." But Reed never called it love, not out loud, not even when Julian did. To friends, Julian was his roommate. At faculty dinners, he was my oldest companion. And when Julian once called their relationship a partnership, Reed smiled briefly and said, "We share something special. No need to define it." It hurt in 1,000 small ways, like paper cuts under salt water. But Julian stayed. He stayed because he thought love was patience, because he believed that Reed wasn't ashamed of him, just afraid of what others might think. Reed had grown up in a conservative family where even the word different was whispered like a curse. Julian told himself that time would do what words could not. He believed that love, when real, would be impossible to keep hidden forever. But love has limits when only one person is allowed to acknowledge it. One morning, Reed left. There was no argument, no closure. Only a note on the counter. "I need to reset my life. Don't wait." Julian waited anyway. Days turned to weeks. Then one day he saw it, not a message, not a call, a wedding announcement, forwarded from an old friend. Reed Mavern was engaged to a woman. The caption read, "Beginning a new chapter with the love of my life." Julian read it once, then again, and again, and then he stopped breathing. The man he had loved in silence, had waited for through all the excuses and half-promises, was starting a new life, as someone else, with someone else, publicly, proudly, as if those years with Julian had been nothing but a detour. Julian left the city weeks later. Not to run away, but to let go of a life he had been the only one holding on to. He took a job teaching literature at a quiet suburban high school, a place where no one knew his past, a place where love didn't need to be erased because it never had the chance to exist. He built his life on structure, routine, and the predictable. His classroom became his haven, his students, the reason he showed up every morning. And yet, every time he caught the flicker of hope in a young boy's eyes, the shy glance between two boys afraid to be seen, or the quiet fear of difference in a growing teenager, he remembered. He remembered what it was like to love in the dark. And he promised himself if he ever had a chance to protect someone from that kind of silence, he would, because nothing destroys love like being told it's not allowed to exist. If this story touches something inside you, don't forget to follow Heart Stories for more emotional journeys that speak what many are too afraid to say out loud. Years passed. The classroom aged with Julian new coats of paint, new books, new students. But his silence stayed untouched. He taught literature the way others taught survival, not as words on a page, but as lifelines. He told his students that poetry was the language of the unspoken, that a character's silence often said more than their dialogue. And they believed him, because he lived it. Then one autumn morning, a name on the new student list made him stop breathing: Jace Maver. The surname struck like static in his chest, but it couldn't be. He thought, it's just a name. The world is full of children named Mavern. He saw the boy for the first time in the back row, quiet, eyes lowered, clothes too neat for a child his age. And then, the way he tilted his head when confused. The same way Reed used to, the same hands, long fingers fidgeting with the edge of his book. Julian's heart knew before his mind dared to confirm. He told himself he wouldn't ask, wouldn't dig, wouldn't reopen doors that were slammed shut years ago. But the answer came anyway. 3 weeks into the term, during parent-teacher conferences, Julian was preparing student notes when he felt it. That presence. He looked up. Reed Mavern stood in the doorway. Older now, the sharp edges of his youth had softened into something more tired. There were new lines on his face, but the same guarded eyes. He didn't flinch. He didn't smile. He simply said, "Jace speaks highly of you." Well, Julian nodded, kept his voice steady. "He's a thoughtful student." Reed shifted his weight, looked away. "He's been through a lot. Divorce hit him hard. His mother left the picture a while ago. I'm trying to give him stability." Julian wanted to ask 1,000 questions about the marriage, about the loss, and about the choice Reed made to erase everything they once were. But instead, he said nothing. He just watched the man who had once told him love didn't need a name now standing in a school hallway, quietly trying to be a father to a boy who didn't know what his father had once run from. After that meeting, Julian couldn't unsee what he saw in Jace. The boy carried silence the way Reed once did, like a shield made of glass, clear but breakable. He didn't speak much in class, but he wrote, and what he wrote began to trouble Julian. Short stories about boys who turned invisible to stay safe. Poems about masks stitched into skin. One composition ended with the line, "Sometimes, I wonder if I was born to be hidden." Julian read it over and over. He knew what it meant, because he had written the same thoughts, just in different words, in a different time. But what tore at him wasn't the sadness in the writing, it was the fear. The same fear that Reed had lived in. The same fear that had killed something beautiful between them. Julian began to spend more time with Jace after class, under the guise of tutoring. He never asked direct questions. He never assumed. He just created space. And in that space, Jace began to speak, not about identity or fear or names, but about pressure, about how his father worked so hard and how he didn't want to be a disappointment, about how he didn't know how to tell someone the truth when he wasn't even sure what the truth was. Julian listened, patiently, quietly, because sometimes that's all a boy needs to feel safe enough to start answering his own questions. Still, he never mentioned Reed, never let on that he once knew the boy's father in a way no one else had. But it haunted him, the symmetry of it all, because the son was now standing at the edge of the same cliff the father once fled from. Julian didn't know if it was fate, punishment, or some cruel design, but he knew this: he would not let silence win again. Not this time. Not through another boy. Not if he could help it. There's a kind of pain that doesn't die. It just changes shape. And sometimes it comes back wearing a younger face, asking to be saved. And this time, Julian was listening. Some stories pass through generations without a word ever spoken. They live in glances, in silences, in the way someone flinches when you ask, "Are you okay?" Julian had seen it before in Reed. Now he saw it again. In Reed's son, Jace had begun staying later after school. He said he liked the quiet, that his house felt too empty. He worked on poetry assignments, read classic novels with Julian's guidance, and once or twice left behind his journal by accident. Julian never opened it. He didn't have to. The way Jace hesitated before every word in class said more than any private page could. One afternoon, just before the fall break, Jace lingered at his desk longer than usual. The classroom was empty. Outside, the wind pushed against the windows like a warning. Jace stared at the poster above the chalkboard, Walt Whitman's quote, "I am large, I contain multitudes." Then he asked, almost too softly, "Do you think someone can be different and still be normal?" Julian didn't respond right away. He had learned it over the years, that words matter most when they are few and true. So he said only this: "I think hiding who you are is what makes people feel broken, not who they are." Jace didn't nod. He didn't argue. But for the first time, his shoulders fell in that way people do when they stop bracing for judgment. In the days that followed, Julian noticed changes. Jace walked with less caution. He smiled, occasionally. But he also became more distant from his classmates, especially after one of them made a cruel joke about boys who cry in poetry class. Julian reported the incident, but Jace brushed it off. "It's fine," he said. "I'm used to it." That sentence hit harder than any insult. "I'm used to it" was the anthem of a boy who had never been protected. Later that week, Julian ran into Reed again, this time outside the school, at a local caf. The encounter was accidental, but heavy with unsaid history. Reed looked older than before, not just in his face, but in his posture, like someone who had carried a truth too long without ever letting it breathe. They spoke briefly: weather, work, Jace's writing talent. Then Reed paused, lowered his gaze, and asked, "Is he doing okay, I mean?" Really, Julian could have said so many things about the pain Jace carried, about the pressures he never voiced, about how the boy was on a path Reed once ran from. But he said only, "He's trying." Also, Reed looked away, jaw tightening. "I was never taught how to be honest. Not with others, not with myself." Julian didn't reply. There was nothing to say that wouldn't feel like a wound reopened. Still, something shifted. Days later, Jace shared a poem in class, a personal piece he titled Blueprint. It was about building a house where no one had to whisper, where walls didn't echo shame. It ended with the line, "Maybe I'll build what my father never lived in." When Reed came in for the next parent conference, Julian handed him a copy of that poem. Reed read it in silence, then folded it carefully and tucked it into his jacket. He didn't speak, but his hands trembled. After that, something in Reed began to change. Not quickly, not perfectly, but enough. He started showing up more. He waited outside the school instead of honking from the curb. He asked questions. He listened. Julian watched, quietly from the edges, resisting the urge to expect anything from the man who had once left everything behind. Until one day, Reed asked if they could talk alone, just once. They sat in the empty classroom, late afternoon light slanting across the desks. Reed looked at the chalkboard, as if afraid of Julian's face, and said, "I never told him. I never told him who I really am. I thought I was protecting him. But now, I think I'm just handing him my fear." Julian breathed in, slow and deep. This wasn't closure, it wasn't an apology, but it was something. "Then don't hand it to him," he said. "Hand him truth instead." That night, Julian stayed late. Alone in the classroom, he erased the chalkboard, cleaned the desks, turned off the lights, but inside, something remained illuminated. Because a boy was starting to build a home out of words, and a man who once tore down his own was finally learning how to be the father that boy needed. The winds of winter came early that year, sharp and sudden, the way truth tends to arrive after too much silence. The leaves had barely finished falling when the letter reached Reed's mailbox. Thick paper, formal tone, stamped by the family court. His past had found its way back, dressed in legalese. His ex-wife was filing for full custody of Jace. Julian heard the news not from Reed, but from Jace quietly. After school, as he packed his books slower than usual, the boy didn't cry. He just said, "She wants to take me away. Says I shouldn't be raised by someone unstable." Julian knew what that meant before Jace could finish the sentence. It wasn't about income or safety or parenting style. It was about the whispered past finally shouted into a courtroom. That night, Julian sat alone at his desk, reading a short story Jace had submitted for class. It was about a bird who had never flown because it had spent its life in a cage made of mirrors, always seeing itself, never seeing sky. Julian didn't sleep. In the following weeks, preparations began. Reed looked thinner, like something inside him was hollowing out. He tried to remain calm for Jace's sake, but fear clung to his every movement. He'd built his life around being careful. Now he was being punished for not being honest sooner. Julian watched it unfold from a distance, unable to intervene, bound by the thin veil of professionalism that separated him from a family unraveling. Still, he found himself staying later, checking on Jace more often, leaving small notes of encouragement hidden in books, grading his poems with trembling hands. Then, one evening, Reed asked Julian to meet him, not at school, but in the small park where they used to walk during those hidden years. Reed looked like a man caught between two cliffs, unsure which would hurt more, jumping forward or falling back. "She's using everything," he said. "Old messages, hints, rumors, even pictures from when you and I were still something." Julian said nothing. The truth didn't need defending. "She says I'm confused, that a boy like Jace shouldn't grow up around confusion, that I'm teaching him shame." Well, Julian looked at him then, not with anger, not with sympathy, but with the clear gaze of someone who had outlived both. "You're not confused," he said quietly. "You're just late." Reed exhaled, like the words had taken something heavy from his chest. The court date came sooner than expected. Jace sat between his father and a lawyer he barely knew. Across the room, his mother looked polished, calm, as if she'd rehearsed her performance well. Her case wasn't framed in hatred. It was dressed in concern. She didn't attack Reed for being gay. She simply implied that a boy needed a role model who lived a clear, stable life, and that Reed's past relationships and fluid presentation created an unpredictable environment. Julian sat in the back of the courtroom, every muscle tensed. He wasn't allowed to speak. But if love could echo through presence, he hoped his silence was loud enough to hold Reed steady. Then the judge asked if either parent had a final statement. Reed stood. For a moment, his hands trembled. Then he folded them and spoke, not as a man on trial, but as a father who had decided he would no longer whisper. "I spent most of my life hiding," he said. "I thought if I lived quietly, I could protect my son from the judgment I once ran from. But silence doesn't protect, it erodes." He paused, voice steadying. "Yes, I once loved a man, and for a long time, I pretended that meant something was broken in me, but it didn't. What broke me was the pretending." He looked toward Jace, then back at the court. "My son deserves to live in a world where love doesn't have to be hidden. If I lose him for being honest, then I never had the right to be his father in the first place." The room fell quiet. Even the judge looked caught off guard, not by the confession, but by its calmness. There was no anger, no self-defense, just truth, laid bare. Julian watched Reed return to his seat. He didn't look for approval. He didn't glance back. For the first time in their shared history, he didn't seek permission to be who he was. He simply was. The ruling came a week later, quiet and without ceremony. The court upheld Reed's custody. There was no fanfare, no declaration of victory, only a signed decision, quietly placed into a manila folder, handed over by a clerk who likely had no idea what that paper meant to a boy waiting outside the courtroom doors. Julian was not there that day. He didn't need to be. He knew the outcome from the way Jace appeared at his classroom door the next morning. No words, just a nod, a half smile, and a folded piece of paper slid onto his desk before the boy walked away. Julian waited until the room emptied before opening it. It was a poem, a simple one, just 12 lines. It spoke of shadows that once scared the writer, of how sometimes the things we feared growing up were the very things we became. But the final line stayed with Julian long after the bell rang. He stopped whispering, and so I started speaking. Later that afternoon, Reed appeared outside the school. No appointment, no pretense. Just a man holding a small envelope in both hands like it was fragile. He didn't ask to come in. He just stood by the old oak tree, the one Julian used to lean against when waiting for Reed in younger, quieter days. Julian joined him there. Reed offered the envelope. "It was supposed to be a letter," he said. "One I wrote years ago. I found it in a box I hadn't opened since before I got married." Julian held the envelope but didn't open it. Reed continued. "I never sent it. I told myself it was too late, that you'd moved on, but maybe it wasn't for you. Maybe it was for me. A way to prove to myself that I once had the courage to feel something real. He looked out toward the street, where Jace was waiting by the car, headphones on, gazing up at the sky. I don't expect anything, Reed said. Not from you. I just wanted you to know. I told him everything. Not just that I used to love a man, but that I loved you. Julian didn't speak. He simply placed the envelope into his bag, not as a relic of the past, but as a page that still had the power to mean something. That evening, he opened it. The letter was dated almost 15 years ago. The ink had faded, but the words still cut deep. It didn't apologize. It didn't ask for forgiveness. It only said you were the one thing I never had the courage to name. But you were the only thing that ever felt true. Julian folded the paper gently, placed it into the back of a book on his shelf, and stared at it for a long time. Not with pain, but with understanding. Because sometimes people don't come back to stay. They come back to hand you the piece of yourself they were once too afraid to hold. Weeks passed. Life resumed its rhythm. Jace continued to write. His words grew bolder, brighter. He submitted a piece to a national teen writing contest. The prompt was, describe a moment that made you believe in family. His essay didn't talk about his parents, or even Julian. It told the story of a house with creaky floorboards and books piled everywhere, of a teacher who never asked questions he wasn't ready to answer, of a courtroom where his father finally chose truth over fear. He ended it with one line, maybe a home isn't where you're told you belong, but where no one asks you to change in order to stay. Julian read that line again and again. It didn't need a signature. He knew who wrote it. He knew who it was for. If someone once hurt you by hiding who they were, but later stood up for someone else using the truth they once denied, could you forgive them? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe to Heart Stories, where every voice deserves to be heard and every heart has a place.